Let me tell you the story of Abraham Seats and how that relates to the reading of the Gospels. The one book that we don't use from the New Testament in the standard lectionary of the church is the book of Revelation, is the book of the Apocalypse. If you look very carefully, we never ever read the book of Revelation any time in the whole year. Now, what happened was the monks living in the monasteries in Egypt, who have a little bit more of an apocalyptic worldview, said, man, the church doesn't want us to read the book of the Apocalypse. I know what we can do. Everyone's asleep now because everyone's really tired from the Good Friday. Let's stay up all night before anyone else wakes up, and we're going to read the whole thing cover to cover. All right? So that was how the reading of the book of Revelation came into the lectionary of the church. But strictly speaking, theologically speaking, the church says the book of Revelation should not be used to derive doctrine that can't be derived from any of the other books of the Bible. Now, the reason I say all of this is that what we find, in fact, in the New Testament is a hierarchy. We have the Gospels as the highest point, and then we finally get to the most challenging of the books, the book of Revelations. So the Gospel, the book of Revelation, and that's the point at which the church says, okay, we'll put it in the Bible, but please don't get too carried away with it. Because it's a very difficult book to read, and if you try to understand it, you're actually going to maybe get yourself into a bit of trouble. Now, where did the Gospels themselves come from? And I'll give you a clue. It's all around us. Let me ask another question. Does anyone know what the first books in the Bible to be written were? In the New Testament, sorry. Does anyone know what the first book to be written was? Or the first group of books? The Pauline epistles, thank you very much. Well done. 10 points to Gryffindor. Hufflepuff, sorry. Not Slytherin? No, okay, right, yeah. I've got a soft spot for Severus Snape because he's named after my favourite saint, but yeah. Sorry. So, what was I saying before? Now I'm thinking about Harry Potter. Pauline epistles, thank you very much. Pauline epistles. They were written first. Then, we start to find the writing of the Gospels. So, does anyone know roughly when that started? Yeah, they started to be written, about, from 60 to 90, or maybe even up to about 100 is when the Gospels were written. Now, I want you to think very practically. How old would, say, a typical apostle, a disciple of Christ who saw Christ face to face, have been in the year 60 AD? 60-ish. A young one would have been 50. St. Mark would have been about 50. An older apostle, maybe somebody like Peter, might have been 70, or maybe even a little bit older. We're not entirely sure. But what do you think happens to people when they get to 50? I'm 51. 60 and 70. What happens to them? Right? They start to pass away. Isn't it interesting that the Gospels started to be written at the time that the apostles started to pass away? Why was that? Let's play a little thought experiment. And let's imagine for a second that we are sitting here in church and Abuna has said, look, I've got a very special guest coming in today. St. Mark is coming here today. Okay, and we're going to sit around and we're going to celebrate the liturgy of St. Mark. Okay, and afterwards you guys we can all sit down, and for the sermon, he's going to answer any question that you have. Right? What kind of question do you think you would ask St. Mark? Would you say, can you please explain the double slit experiment in quantum mechanics? Right? Would you say, can you please tell me what horse I need to put my money on for the Melbourne Cup? What would you ask St. Mark? If you could see St. Mark, Nobody has anything? Yes? What was it like to be with Christ? St. Mark, tell us. We haven't met this guy. Tell us about Christ. What was he like? And St. Mark would go, oh, mate, I've got some stories to tell you. It was so embarrassing. I'll tell you this really embarrassing story. Don't tell me, it's just between us, you know. The night he was betrayed, I got really scared and I ran off naked. And I left my tunic behind and it was so embarrassing. Right? So he would tell accounts of what it was like to be with Jesus. And so at the liturgy, within the context of the church, that is where the gospel was revealed on a Sunday as part of the liturgy by the eyewitnesses of Christ. Now, what do you think was happening as they start to die, as they start to get old? What do you think the people start thinking to themselves? Yeah, we better write this stuff down. This is gold. I know Mark told us not to tell people the story about him running away naked and stuff, but I'm sure he won't mind. So let's start writing this stuff down. Or, Mark, can you please write this down for us before you start to forget the stuff? Yes.
When people get old, this is serious.
Yeah.
They also start to get spiritual. How do you take that? How do you take what they're saying?
Yes, excellent. So the question is, when they get old, and let's say that the cognitive decline starts to set in, how can you trust what it is that they have to say? Because what was written in those Gospels wasn't simply what the last thing they said was. It was a collection of 30 years of the stories that they told about Christ. All right? So in other words, we know, in fact, if you read St. Paul's epistles, we know, for example, that he had help writing things. So let's look at the Gospel of St. Mark. Is it the Gospel of St. Mark? The answer is unequivocally yes. Does that mean that he was the one that physically held the quill to write it? Not necessarily. We don't know. But that's not the point. The point is that the Gospel is preached by St. Mark and is written down as part of the liturgy of the church to remember the events of our Lord Jesus Christ's life. So, number one important lesson to take away from that. What is the context of the Bible? What is the proper context? What's the proper context of the Bible? What's the proper context of the Bible? It's the church. So in other words, the proper reading of the Bible is when we read it together as a church. When we listen to Abuna's sermon explaining the Bible to us. That is the number one proper context for the Bible. And that ensures that idiots like me can't go home to their wives and say, oh, well, Abraham had concubines. Because she'll say, well, hang on, did Abuna tell you that? Right? And hopefully Abuna didn't tell me that. And so therefore, reading the Bible together in church is one of the best guarantees of making sure that we read the Bible properly. Because that's its home ground. That's where it grew from. Now, let me tell you something interesting about this idea of the stories being within the community and them being written, perhaps even at different stages. Can someone please open for me the second last chapter of the Gospel of St. John?
Is it these things are written so that
Speaking to both of them.
these things are written so that you may believe Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and believe in
Excellent.
One of Alex's glasses on.
Okay, of course, yep. Rock and roll. That was awesome. Yeah, so the second last chapter ends with something that sounds like what? Like an ending. And these things were written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ. Thank you very much for coming. Good night. And then we turn the page over, and there's another chapter. What's going on? And then we start to read the story of the apostles on the shore going fishing, and then our Lord Jesus Christ appears to them. So why is it done like that? But one thing that's interesting is if you look at St. John's Gospel, the thinking among scholars is whenever you read a text that says, well, refers to St. John as the one whom Jesus loved, that in fact was written a few decades after the original part of the Gospel was written. So that second ending is an addendum to the original text of the Gospel. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean that it's not authentic? No, because remember, how is the Gospel read? In the church. Who carries the stories that John said? The church, the community of John. If 10 years down the track they said, oh my God, we didn't make note of, remember the story he told us about when they were on the shore, and oh man, how embarrassing, we forgot to do that. John might have passed away, and so they love John, and they think he's awesome, he's the goat, right? And so when they write about him, they call him the one whom Jesus loved. So that's an explanation, at least, or an attempted explanation, as to why, the St. John's Gospel seems to have this really interesting, layered structure to it. That's for the practical reason, but yeah, theologically, absolutely spot on. Now, does that mean it's not valid? And that's not the case. It's valid because, like I said, it's the church that carries the memories of what John said and did. If 10 years down the track they remember that there was something that they forgot to add in, it is completely within their right to add that to the text. That doesn't at all undermine the text at all. What do we say when we go to read the Gospel? We say a reading from the Holy Gospel according to St. John. Do we say a reading from the Holy Gospel written by St. John? So in other words, even in the memory of the church, we know that this is what John told us. Who physically did the writing is irrelevant. And whether they forgot the first time and they added it a little bit later on, doesn't matter. It is all inspired, and it is all the text that God intended for us to read in the Holy Scriptures. So now that we've had a look at all of these things, when it comes to reading the New Testament, in some ways it's a little bit easier than when it comes to reading the Old Testament. The Old Testament was always a little bit tricky for the church to read. And the church always struggled with, how are we going to read this text? Actually, let me just write down the things that we've come up with so far. Right, so the Bible is the church's book. And so the church is the right authority to interpret it. Let me get back to Harry Potter for a second. Let's say we are fighting over which house is better, Gryffindor or Hufflepuff. Okay, now, can I have an opinion about that? Of course I can. Can you have an opinion about that? Who do you think would be the best person to ask about which house is better? I've got some bad news. It's not real, right? J.K. Rowling, right? The person who's responsible for the text. So who's responsible for the text of the Bible? In terms of who's the mechanical receiver of the text? The church. So who's the best person to ask as to what something means? The church. Okay? So that's the most important thing to understand. Now, let's get into some mechanical things to do with the interpretation of the Bible. There are different ways in which the scripture was read and understood in the early church. I'm not going to talk about the modern church,